Tonight is no exception. And tonight, though, it's different because we not only have a practicing scientist, although he devotes most of his time to education, public outreach, but we also have two journalists and a chef. Now, food is very important in all of our lives, and we make our food decisions not only on what science tells us, but on our personal and family values, the kinds of foods that we grew up with, the cultures that we live in and we're raised in. And our food choices depend upon many inputs, of which science is only one and often plays a relatively minor role in the food choices that we make. Now, this is the way the evening is going to go. First of all, Mark Lynas, who's in London, discovered this afternoon that if he were going to participate live, it would be about 2 in the morning when he got to bed, and he has commitments tomorrow. So he made a statement, and we recorded it. We're going to start off playing that statement. It's about 7 minutes long. So that will be his opening statement, his closing statement, and everything we're going to hear from him for the entire evening. Following that, I will invite the panelists up to the tables, and I'm going to ask if any of them have any reaction to what Mark has said in his statement. And then I will ask a series of questions of our panelists. I will invite each of them to respond to answers given by whoever does the answer so that we can have a robust discussion. And then when we get to about a little after 8, we're going to come out to you so you can ask your questions. And we will end with having each of our panelists make a closing statement, and I will give my own opening statement. So Mark Lynas wrote a very influential article, op-ed piece in the April 26, 2015 issue of the New York Times, How I Got Converted to GMO Food. And he's going to tell you some of the reasons why he got converted. So can we play the video, Derek? I think you wrote a very important op-ed piece in the New York Times, How I Got Converted to GMO Food. I want you to tell our class what are some of the reasons that converted you from being a GMO, whether you were an atheist or an agnostic, to a believer in GMOs. What were some of the factors that led to that conversion?
Well, actually, I was more than an atheist or a skeptic. I was an out-and-out anti. And in the latter part of the 1990s, I was involved in destroying GMO crop trials in the UK and occupying Monsanto, and very much involved in the kind of the grassroots anti-GMO movement in its incipient phase in the UK. I also appeared on TV and did really numerous things as part of that campaign. So I was very much determined to remove this technology from the face of the earth, as I think many anti-GMO people still are. What changed my mind? It wasn't like there was a single light bulb moment, but it was a long-term process, really, of discovering that I'd essentially been misinformed, and that I had not. Well, I hadn't. It wasn't that I'd misunderstood the science; it was that I hadn't bothered to read the science, and in fact, the science was kind of irrelevant to the campaign. This was a political campaign because we identified GMOs with certain things that we were against. We identified GMOs with monoculture, with big corporations like Monsanto, with chemicals and pesticides, with farmers losing control over their seeds and all this kind of stuff. So it was kind of a political economy objection, really, to a scientific technology. And of course, that has the roots of illogicality, because there's no logical reason, really, why any particular technology should only benefit any particular political entity, whether it's a corporation or something else. But I think the real crucial point was the issue of safety, because we used to go around saying that GMOs were bad for your health, or hinting that it was poisonous, or that there was some health and safety concern. And in the UK, this came immediately after the mad cow disease crisis. So everyone had really lost trust in the regulators and the sort of scientific authorities. but I went off to write books about climate change, so I got very immersed in a different area of scientific controversy, and I spent a lot of time trying to communicate the scientific consensus on climate change and saying, look, the vast majority of the global scientific community asserts that the global warming is real and that it's human caused, and you can't just ignore and reject a scientific consensus of that nature. And the problem I then had was that there's also a scientific consensus that GMO technology is safe, and that the products which are available now in the human food chain are no different and no less safe than conventional foods. So I didn't, I was part of a movement really which was pro-science on climate change and anti-science on GMOs, and I didn't want to be inconsistent about these things. And so I had to change my mind to be consistent with the scientific community, which I'd begun to identify with. I had to change my mind on the GMO issue.
I think many of the people who are anti-GMO they're unfamiliar with the literature, the real literature. So it's the reason we're giving this course is to allow the public to learn more from specialists about the advantages, the disadvantages of GMOs, what the science tells us about health and so on. Do you agree on the importance of public education? And you've written some very important books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a science communicator, so of course I agree that public communication is important, and it's something that the scientific community often doesn't get right. I mean, the skills you need to be an effective scientist are pretty much the opposite of the skills you need to be an effective communicator. To be a good scientist, you need to be to really think about uncertainties. You need to know a lot about statistics. You need to not make exaggerated claims, and so on and so forth. And you need to take a lot of time over things and reach only very tentative conclusions. And constantly remind yourself that your hypothesis may not be correct. That's very different to being an effective communicator who needs to go out there, to get people to believe you and to be a strong sort of speaker or media person. You need to go out there and make strong statements all the time. You don't go on about uncertainty, and so it's very difficult, I think, for scientists to get out there and to really, become a part of some of these important debates. And what happened really on the GMO debate was that the voices of the scientists just got drowned out, essentially, because there was just the level of noise was so high, and scientists weren't really, just weren't really able to participate in a way which was meaningful to them. And it's become very polarized and very divided, and I know a lot of scientists, molecular biologists, people involved in genetic engineering work now, who have had a really, really tough time. I mean, they get hate mail, they get even death threats, their families can be targeted, that kind of thing. And so when people go into these kinds of careers, as far as they're concerned, they're just out there to make better crops, to help feed the world or whatever. And then suddenly they find themselves in the middle of this kind of a political controversy, and I think it's very difficult for a lot of scientists who aren't natural communicators to know what to do.
Mark, thank you. This has been very, very helpful. You're one of our most talented, gifted science communicators, and I'm looking forward to your next book. Do you have any additional parting thought, knowing who we've heard from earlier in the course and knowing who is on the panel? Any closing message you'd like to deliver?
Well, you mentioned about writing a book. I'm actually writing a book on the GMO issue now, because it does require a huge amount of information, and it's too much to ask people to have to read the scientific literature to decide what they're going to sit down and eat. And so I think the basic starting point that most of us might as well have is that the experts are probably right when they've assessed something independently hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of times. The anti-GMO movement for me has become rather aligned with the anti-vaccination movement and some of the other anti-science movements, and a lot of it fundamentally comes down to conspiracy theories about the role of corporations, about experts supposedly stitching things up behind closed doors, and so on and so forth. And even if you do believe in some of these aspects, you should not reject an entire technology, because any technology can be used to do good or can be used to do bad. So let's at the very least look at things on a case-by-case basis, GMOs included.
I also asked Mark in this whether after he did the op-ed piece, whether he had received any of those kinds of threats. And he said that he had, but they actually had started earlier at a lecture he gave at Oxford. Now I'd like to have our panelists join me. Any reaction to that? I think I'm going to start with you, Alan. You're not only an outstanding scientist, but an outstanding science communicator. So you've been able to do something he said it's difficult for you guys to accomplish.
Well, thanks. I have met Mark just once in the past, so we had a chat, and I heard most of this. And of course, my question to him was, what happened in your experience? So he didn't really say anything that was new to me, but I do appreciate his taking the time to challenge his own philosophical beliefs. That he started out being anti-GMO, largely on the basis of emotions and even perhaps some of the conspiracy theory stuff, and decided that he would go look at the evidence, the scientific evidence, and keep an open mind. So I greatly appreciate that, and I appreciate also that he has gone on to the public stage, because he is a great science communicator, as you can tell, and it's very lonely on that stage, particularly when people in the audience are preparing to throw things at you. And
you're safe tonight, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. But I have to be prepared for that. And part of my job, it is in my job description as a professor at the University of California, to engage with the public and at least address some of the concerns, misunderstandings, or even emotions. That's fair enough too. So I mean, it is in my job description. Yeah, feel free to throw away.
Would either of you like to add to what Mark said? Go ahead, Nathanael.
I'd just like to say one thing, which is, I guess, by Mark's definition, I may not be quite as good a communicator as him, because I love to dwell in the nuance and uncertainty. And I think there does tend to be a slippage. I mean, he's absolutely right that on the hardcore anti-GMO contingent, it's rife with conspiracy theory and misinformation. But I think that there's the vast majority of people who have some concern about GMOs, or just have a vague sense that perhaps I don't know what this is entirely, but I'm a little bit worried about it. These people aren't conspiracy theorists. They're Americans, essentially. And so I think that's worth pointing out.
Paul, would you like to add anything to this?
I listened to what he had to say, but I think going from occupying Monsanto and anti-GMO, and he kind of seemed to me that he lost interest, and that he went to climate change as a new thing to write about and a new thing to be passionate about. But within that industry, there is a lot of science, and to be respected in the scientific communities, I think if I was in his position, I would feel a little bit of pressure to, change my opinion slightly on the GMO hardline. I would agree that GMOs have been vilified, and there are some things that are true statements about them, and many things that are misconceptions about them. But I think the general public doesn't know except what they see on TV, and if it's, if you have a bunch of people wanting to, rush the gates, then sometimes you rush with them without reading all the information that you should. And he's getting more information on the subject now because he's writing a book, which is great.
Right. Can you hear us in the back? Somebody raise your hand in the back. You can hear. Okay, good. All right. So labeling is a big issue. And Nathanael, you wrote in Grist in December of 2015, quote, "Here's how to do GMO labeling so everyone wins." How does everyone win? What's your recipe for success?
So I need to back up just a step and talk about what's positive and what's negative about GMO labeling. I think what's positive about GMO labeling is that there's obviously a movement for this. There are a lot of people who want GMOs labeled. When you see the votes in California and Oregon, there's something like 50% of people who are, or a little less in each case, in Washington, who are interested in this. So there is an interest. And I also think that labeling takes away this kind of looming unknown. Instead of it being an unknown entity, it's just there on the label, and you can see that the cereal that you eat every morning, it's just there every time you pour it in. So I think that's the positive. I think there's a chance that it would completely normalize GMOs. On the negative side, when you have just one thing labeled and nothing else, then that becomes the dominant thing that people think perhaps they have to be concerned about. And there's lots of interesting things and important things about our food that I think we should be more concerned about. The use of various types of chemicals on farms, the way that farm workers are treated, the way that animals are treated, the agronomic techniques and how that affects the soil and the water. All of these things really have real impacts in terms of the environment and in terms of our society. And so how do we capture all of that information, give people the information that they're demanding, but also give them information that's actually useful. And one way of doing that is to provide a ton of information through a small space on the package with a barcode. And this, right now there's a lot of talk about a QR code, which would require a smartphone, but if you just had a barcode, there's something called Good Guide that's been doing this for 15 years now, where you don't need a smartphone. Any phone with a camera on it, you can take you and give you a text with information on it. And so 90% of Americans have phones with cameras on them. You could have a kiosk in the front for the rest. And we could really start to provide some real information that would actually have some legitimate environmental impact.
So you don't have to have an enormously large label. You have a portal there that gets you into the information.
That's right.
So if I'm in the grocery store and I'm going to buy a turkey.
Right. So yeah, about 10 years ago, I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine called The Transparent Barcode. And the genesis of the piece was the fact that I talked to this heritage turkey grower who was offering people the chance to see the turkey cam, and so you could see Tom there strutting around, and you could see what the farm looked like, and do all this through accessing a website via a barcode. And so if we did this and made it mandatory, people who wanted to know if their foods were GMO could know, but they also might see, oh, this food was used in a type of farming that lost 3 inches of topsoil over the last 5 years, and this food wasn't. There's a lot of tricks to making that work, but I know people who work at big corporations who think that they can do that tracking all the way through the system.
So Paul, would you use that when you're looking to buy happy turkeys?
I think I do research on all of the food that I'm providing to my guests. The connection between the farmer's market is most important to me, but there's times where you can't go to a farmer and get 2 sacks of onions because they just don't produce that, and that's not the thing that they bring to the market. So I have to rely on a combination of some commodity products and support my farmers as much as possible. So I think if I could go to a website or if I could look at a product and I was making a decision whether I wanted to use it for my family or for my business, that I would love to be able to connect that way on my phone and be able to go right to finding out more information about what they do. I think these days too with farmers, they're going to have they can't really afford to have organic certification, but a larger company that would have a product in a store would definitely have the ability to, tell you exactly, their story, and then you have the confidence of that, then you can use it or choose to or not.
So, Alan, what's your take on labeling, and what's the big Vermont decision that's going to come about?
Well, I'm not entirely sure whether the Vermont decision will come about. As you know, it's under litigation and may be overturned or maybe not. But in any case, it looks like most of the big food producers are going to label voluntarily anyway. But my take on labeling goes back a number of years. As I mentioned to you, or as I was introduced, I'm a public sector proponent, and it is my belief that people have a right to know what they're buying, whether it's a food or a bicycle or whatever. And then the question was, how do we actually implement that right? First of all, there is no law that says you have a right, right? It's not codified in any law anywhere, but it's a general understanding. I certainly accept that I have a right to know. If I'm putting down my money, I have a right to know what's in that thing. Short of trade secrets. We're not allowed to know what the ingredients are in Coca-Cola or Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? And they've been around for a long time. But I did also write a book, Pandora's Picnic Basket. It's now 16 years old, and
But still available on Amazon.
I'm not flogging it, but if you're interested, get it used on Amazon.
That's what I did.
That's the best way to get it. The labeling chapter is the longest chapter. And when I sat down to write that chapter, it was, okay, the starting premise is people have a right to know. How do we make that work for GMO foods? And as I was writing, I came to the unnerving conclusion that this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. Labeling for process, and genetic modification as a process, doesn't work because, for a number of different reasons, we don't label process on any of our foods in a mandatory manner. Right? Organic is a process, and that's a very important part of our food supply. But it's a voluntary label, and people voluntarily purchase organic products. It's not for commodities, it's a specialty product. And most of the time, our GMO foods are made from commodities: corn, soybean, cottonseed, canola. So as I was trying to figure out how to make this work, when I looked at the problems with process-based mandatory labeling, which is what is in effect in Europe and also, I think, the Vermont legislation, the biggest problem technically is that we can't verify everything that's a GMO. Now, I'm not talking about a tomato with a fish gene. That's easy to do. That's not what the issue is about. Right? We can easily detect a fish gene in a tomato. We can verify it. But what about something like sugar? Right? Sugar is a purified chemical, sucrose. It comes either from genetically engineered sugar beet in this country. About half of our domestic supply of sugar comes from genetically engineered sugar beet. The other half comes from sugar cane, which is not genetically engineered in this country. It is in other countries. So if you get a packet of sugar and you're wondering as a consumer, is this a genetically engineered product or not? You have no way of knowing for sure. Whether there's a label on it or not, you have no way of knowing for sure. No independent lab can verify that that product is actually from a genetically engineered sugar beet. Genetic engineering does not impart any new ingredients into the food. Right? But the plant is genetic, the genes in the plant are certainly changed. But the same is true with ordinary breeding. And if we're going to go to process-based labeling for things like sugar, as the Europeans have done, then what's to stop other people or other processes from being labeled? Like we all think that the alternative to genetic modification is traditional crossbreeding, right? Well, how many of you are familiar with ionizing radiation mutagenesis? That's produced over 3,000 crop varieties that we've been consuming since the end of World War II. That's an interesting process. The food is safe. It's been with us for a long time, and nobody's ever been hurt. But genetic modification has been with us as well since the late 1970s, and no one's ever been hurt. No one has ever been documented as having been harmed from consuming a genetically modified food. So it's not a safety issue. So those points, the technicalities of verification, and in this country, if you put a label on something voluntarily, you have to be able to prove it. Right? That's part of our current labeling policy. And our current labeling policy, by the way, will also cover a tomato with a fish gene, even if it isn't genetically engineered, because fish is allergenic. Allergens have to be on the label. And I will tell you this, not only as a consumer advocate, but also as a parent of a child who will go into anaphylactic shock if she ever encounters even so much as a sliver of a nut. So I read labels, and I am a big champion of labels for health, safety, and nutrition, which is what our mandatory labels do now, based on the content of the stuff that you put in your mouth. Not how it was made, or bred, or cooked, but what's actually in the stuff that goes in your mouth. That should be what labels are reserved for,
So,
not voluntary.
I agree with you on the right to know. And based upon GMOs, it would seem to me you have to have some kind of a companion public education program because many people won't know how to interpret the labels.
Well, that's another part of the problem. The FDA regulations on labeling right now say that if you do use a label voluntarily, then it has to be truthful, which means it has to be verified independently, and it cannot be misleading. And as we're all aware, GMOs is a very misleading area. I mean, most people, when you ask them what a GMO is, will give a wide range of answers, right? But in truth, in the US and Canada, we do not have an official definition of GMO because it is so ambiguous and misunderstood. So that is another issue. But by the way, if you do happen to read chapter on labeling here, you will find that my suggestion to get around the mandatory labels while still fulfilling your need or your desire, your right to know what's in your food, is a bar scan.
Interesting. So he was ahead of his time, Nathaniel.
Well,
I
we
just
didn't have QR codes
All right,
in those
now,
days.
You've had a chance to hear a little bit from each of them. I'm going to invite each of you now to make an opening statement about any aspect relevant to this course. The name of the course, Genetically Modified Organisms Separating Fact from Fiction. What would you like to say in 2 minutes that you want everybody to hear about GMOs from your perspective? Nathaniel, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start with a somewhat sensitive confession, given the circumstances, and that is that I was really never that interested in GMOs. I started covering GMOs because my editor told me that I had to, and I really wasn't that excited about it because this issue is just so complicated and so technical and so divisive. I've just seen journalist after journalist work really hard on stories, and no matter how thorough their reporting, no matter how lyrical their writing, they just took it in the neck. But when I started at Grist in 2013, my editor said, no, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this in a different way, because when journalists cover this, it often is done in a fairly superficial way. You know, you get your quote from one side, you get your quote from the other side, and you have these completely contradictory talking points.
Sounds like climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Flying around, and in the course of a busy chasing the news cycle type of day, we just don't have the time and resources to go back and figure out what's bogus and what's real. And so for the next 6 months, that's what I tried to do. I chased down information, and it was incredibly exposed because rather than, I wanted to kind of go figure things out for 6 months and then write something, and instead he said, no, just take the readers on this voyage of discovery with you and just kind of blog as you go, and we'll see what happens. And it was real. People were really, really interested, and it wasn't just the people who wanted to string me up. It was fascinating because people were more interested in this than anything else that I'd ever done. And it just seemed that there really was this hunger for someone to go out there and push the partisans off of their talking points and force them to grapple with the evidence. So as I was doing this, the other thing I wanted to say is, it wasn't like I was breaking news. This is this 30-year-old controversy that I was just rehashing. And so it was fairly successful, and unfortunately that means that I'm stuck in this beat, which involves routine beatings, and I've come to accept that. I think the problem here is that for a lot of people, GMO is this symbol, and it's a symbol for some people of industrial, chemically intensive agriculture, or it's a symbol for progress in this global struggle against poverty and suffering. And people use it as a proxy to talk about these deeply held values. And if you talk about GMOs in this big abstract way, it's just toxic. And it's boring because it's so theoretical that there's no way you can ever prove or disprove a point, and no one ever changes their mind, and everybody involved just ends up getting so frustrated and so angry that they turn into giant dicks. And so my salvation in this, and when I say that I'm not really interested in GMOs, I'm not really interested in GMOs, the abstract symbol. But what I am really interested in are the specifics. I'm a journalist. It's not my job to get people to change their values. It's my job to provide information so that they can figure out what to do to best achieve the goals that those values would indicate. And so instead of looking at GMOs as a symbol, I've just come to ask people to focus on the details. So if you have deeply held beliefs around global hunger, I'd ask you to look at the specific genetic engineering event and ask, is this something that helps the poor? Because there are applications that absolutely do, and there are applications that have nothing to do with that. If your interest is about pesticides, there are GMOs that increase the use of pesticides, there are GMOs that decrease the use of pesticides. If your interest is corporate control and monopoly, there are GMOs that are produced by giant corporations, there are GMOs that are produced by public scientists. So in my thinking, saying that you're pro or anti-GMO is kind of like saying you're pro or anti-hammer. A hammer can be used to build a house in a Habitat for Humanity project, and it can be used to bash in someone's head. So let's stop talking about GMOs, let's stop talking about the pro and anti, and let's start talking about the specific applications.
Thank you. Paul, what would you like everybody to hear?
Well, I loved what he had to hear, or had to say, and actually I learned something from Nathanael about, a specific GMO like for bananas to increase the nutrition level or a certain nutrient in a banana for a community, for a country, that use of a GMO would be, obviously very beneficial. But I think GMOs have unintended uses, and I think that the public outcry may be more for the fact that plants are genetically modified in order to withstand an herbicide. And then the thing is that herbicide is then used more rapidly and more frequently, and that the unintended uses of that GMO use is maybe not as good for us as we think. Herbicides they're cheap and effective, is what we just mentioned a moment ago, is at controlling weeds, and they are, and it's very good for farmers to be able to use something like that. And for years they used it on their fields to clear all the weeds, and then when they're all dead, then they would go ahead and plant. But it wasn't until the invention of a GMO were they able to actually spray the herbicide while the plant was growing your corn. So before it was just clear the field and then plant the corn, let the corn grow, and you had to figure out how to weed those areas without the herbicide, or you had to control your application to a very small area so you wouldn't kill the plant. But now we're genetically modifying that corn so it's resistant, so overhead spraying, or however we want to do it, I can spray as much of it on there as I need to keep down my weeds. And I think that the glyphosate, the is one of the things that probably concerns me the most, is because companies like Monsanto and the other people that are making seeds that are resistant for these herbicides is just going to make the use of the herbicide increased. And they say, well, okay, there's nothing wrong with this herbicide. It is much more benign than the ones that were used before. You know, we're learning to try to use things that are a little bit better for us on our food. But just like a grapevine, you know, it's a pump, and it pumps nutrients out of the ground back up to the grapes. And you're eating those grapes, you're eating what the plant used nutrient-wise in the ground. So if you're spraying any kind of herbicide or a chemical on the ground where a plant is growing, it's going to take in through its roots what it can, and people have a genuine concern that that's going to affect them.
But I think, Paul, what I've heard from Nathanael, like any technology, genetic modification can be used for good or evil, and you can select genetically modified crops that use less pesticide and less herbicide than non-GMO crops.
But they are resistant. The reason you can spray the herbicide is because that you have a genetically modified plant. Otherwise, if you had a normal plant and you sprayed an herbicide on it, wouldn't it kill the plant?
Disagreement over here. No. Alan.
Okay.
Anybody here from a farm? Anybody ever spray a crop that was not a GMO? Yeah. You know, sorry, I hesitate to disagree with my
No, please tell me, because
standard practice in farming. Farmers have to control weeds and insects and diseases, fungus, and so on. And you're talking about Roundup, which is a non-selective herbicide, glyphosate. But farmers control weeds by spraying on them. Now, they can spray a non-selective herbicide on the ground, pre-emergent, as you described, but they can also spray on the crop. Every crop has natural resistance to at least some herbicides. And so, depending on the crop, the farmer will spray the herbicide that that particular crop species will withstand and kill as many weeds as possible. So when farmers choose to go to a GMO crop with herbicide resistance trait, whether it's Monsanto's Roundup Ready or Bayer's Liberty or BASF or some of the others, they're all different chemicals, they all have different chemistries, they all have different benefits and concerns. But what they're doing, what that farmer is doing, is substituting. They're growing a GMO so that they can spray, for example, Roundup, but now they cease spraying what they used to spray on the crop. And in many cases, what they used to spray is really nasty stuff compared to what they're spraying with the GMO. Now, you know, I'm not an apologist for the pesticide company, but that's just basic farming.
Can I say something about that too?
Go ahead.
But I mean, what I've learned from talking to farmers is that every decision is about a trade-off, right? So you can choose to, if you're dealing with weeds, you can use herbicides, you can plow, you can do cultivation, or you can send out people to do hand weeding or with hose, and that's, I mean, there's some fire weeding, but that's about it, right? For weeds, and each of these things have pluses and minuses depending on the situation. So herbicides, you know, I think there's consumer concerns about this. You know, we talk about chemicals. It doesn't feel good. Like, we don't want chemicals sprayed on our food. And every time we introduce a new technology, whether it's a chemical or it's a GMO or it's this, you know, that I'm holding up to my head all the time, there is a potential for something that we have, some unknown to creep up on us. So what if we do cultivation instead? Well, cultivation is an option that has been used for a long time very effectively. The problem with cultivation is that when you tear up the soil, and when it rains, that more of it runs off, and you get more fertilizer runoff. And there's some other issues as well. And then there's weeding. The weeding demands tremendous amount of labor. It costs more money, and really, really hard work. So, I was talking to an organic farmer in the Central Valley who grows cilantro, and he was saying it sort of breaks his heart because he has this work crew come out, and they're out there hand weeding because they can't really use a hoe because it would kill the cilantro as well. It's too inexact. And so they're going out basically on their hands and knees in the sun, and they have an exception to do that because organic can, that's sort of the only thing that they can do, but it would be illegal if it was conventional because it's not really humane. So all of these things, it's these very tricky trade-offs, and I've come to respect the farm. Often the things that I think are completely illogical, I talk to the farmers and they explain why it makes some sense.
And the loss of topsoil, I think, is generally acknowledged as one of the most serious environmental problems globally that we have.
The worst thing that humans have ever done to the face of
Worst
this
thing-
planet
right.
is tillage, cultivation.
And if you are interested in the ocean, the runoff with all of the fertilizers produce these dead zones in the ocean that take a toll on marine life. You haven't had your chance, I guess, to make your opening statement, or have you?
Oh, I'm just happy to make the comments. But if I were to go back and start my 2 minutes, I would say the reason I got involved with the public engagement about GMOs is that I started as a technical scientist. I worked in a lab. I created GMOs. For some species, my lab was the first place where particular species were genetically engineered. And I saw that as an opportunity to overcome some of the problems we have with conventional agriculture, the non-sustainable practices, such as tillage for weed control that we just heard about. It is literally considered the worst thing that humans have done to the planet. And we've been doing it for 10,000 years, our ancestors have. And the availability of a nutritious, cost-effective, sustainable production of food was what sent me to the lab in the first place. And then starting to get the controversy come to me, and people would ask me questions because I was a public scientist. I've always worked in universities, not with government, not with companies. And I saw the need for public education in this. Again, most people don't know what a GMO is. And in actuality, I couldn't give you a definite definition of it either. But the idea of crossing a gene from one species to another, well, that's unnatural, and it must be unhealthy, and it must be hazardous. Well, no. In science, we know that happens in nature all the time. In a laboratory, we do it by human hand under the direction to get a particular objective. But Mother Nature transfers genes around all over the place. And if we were going to be concerned about humans doing this transfer, why are we concerned about sugar beets when we should probably be more concerned about insulin? Any diabetics here? Don't put up your hand. If you're taking insulin, it's genetically engineered. It's genetically engineered from the human gene, right? From within our own sacred genome, our DNA, a piece of that DNA was given to a microbe. And the microbe is able to read that human DNA and make insulin just as if it were in a human. Right? So the biggest GMO in the marketplace is probably insulin, but you never hear any controversy about that. Right? Boy, talk about transferring from one species to another, that's about as far as you can go. But it's not an issue. So, again, these are the kinds of questions that come back to my mind. It's the need for public education. It's the need for an open mind. And again, as a public educator, it's not my job to convince you that GMOs are fine and appropriate and everything, but rather to lay out some of these points and let you ponder them yourself. If you come back at the end of the day and decide you don't like GMOs, then you can buy organic products because organic products are not allowed to use GMOs. Right? Terrific. Then we get to the question of labels. Why do you need a label on everything else if you don't like GMOs? Why do you need a label on everything else if you have the alternatives already available to you? So, these are the types of questions that I grapple with.
Okay, that's very good. Now, Paul, you run a very important, highly regarded catering company. Your success depends upon giving people food they like, they enjoy. Anybody ever tell you they wanted a special meal made of entirely of GMOs?
No,
No?
never.
But do you serve any foods? What about those beets you buy every Friday in the farmer's market? Are those genetically modified?
The beets that I get, that I know of, that from the farmers that I know, from To My Family Farms and from, actually, there's probably not, I mean, you can't say for sure on every single farm. I know the varieties of the ones from Roland, from a few of my farmers, but if I get stuck and they don't have one, if I go to another farmer and I don't ask him, what specific, one that you're using, I know that most of the farmers that I buy from are organic or are using organic practices, and I know that they've actually given me the seeds, and I've seen the seed companies they're buying from, so I know what seeds they're getting. But you can't guarantee that every time, and I can't say that I've never served anything that wasn't genetically modified, because it's impossible, because it's in every wheat, corn, and soy product, most of them on the market. So I can't say that I don't, because it's in cookies, it's in baked goods, and it's really, really hard to to
Pretty
avoid.
ubiquitous in our,
Yeah.
They're not wheat.
Yeah.
There's no GMO wheat yet.
No. Well, I mean, okay, not GMO wheat, but if there is, corn most definitely. Anything that is a corn product is a GMO product, and I'm not so concerned about it being a GMO. And I've probably changed my perception in the last 2 weeks of doing more research to be prepared for this panel, just to understand that it's not so much that I've been against GMOs all this time because I thought that they were completely bad for you, because there is a lot of good benefits to them. But I think it is the unintended consequences that I've been most concerned with, and that's what I want to make sure that I can try to bring to my guests and to my clients. They count on me to bring them the best food possible, and they have the same fears of it being, of it being organic or it being healthy for them. So I think, I want to find out as much as I can so I can educate them and be confident that I'm giving them the best thing that I can give them.
Good. Now, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, I want us to explore the topic of unintended consequences, unintended environmental effects, unintended effects on things like biodiversity, pollinators, etc. And I'm going to ask each of you to give your answer to what does the existing science tell us about unintended consequences of GMOs. So, 10-minute break, and please come back.
load of something.
Take with me because I got to get something to Stanley for Stanley.
If we could have everyone come back, take their seats, we'd like to get started, please.
Yeah.
Right? It can't be sold anymore. It has to be destroyed. Perfectly good food.
No, of course not. No, I don't want it. That's why.
You dump it in the ocean? What becomes the bottom level commodity in that situation?
Right.
And what do you
Oh, yes, it was very exciting news. Been quite a while.
Should have brought my sweater. I
Yeah.
was afraid. I was like, it's so warm. I'm in Southern California.
Thank you very much.
I'm like, it might be over air conditioned.
Yeah.
They did this building also.
I'm in an office where there's no insulation on the rooftop, right? It's just this gap, and so when the sun comes down, it heats the place up and then it just radiates down. So then we're turning on the air conditioning, shut it off because it gets too cold.
Yeah.
Turn it on, shut it off.
The only thing
Because I'm here where the air conditioning is hitting, but my my salesperson, it's going over her head, and then she has a.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started. I want to come back to the topic I said we would come back to after our break. And that is, what does the science tell us about the unintended consequences or collateral effects of genetically modified crops? We had people who expressed concern that we were losing biodiversity. We had people express concern that that was one of the reasons we were losing so many bees. Who wants to start?
appoint somebody? You're the chair.
All right, we'll go to the middle.
Well, okay, I'll start, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, and then maybe turn it over to the scientists to talk about the science. But I mean, I think that it's important to emphasize that whenever we're talking about unintended consequences, we're talking about unknown unknowns, right? What could be happening that may crop up in 30 years that we find out about later, and this is a factor with any technology, and it's something that I grapple with all the time as an environmental journalist, because I do not want to see another dioxin introduced and getting, or lead getting into everybody's houses. At the same time, I'm aware that we're in a planetary crisis and that we need dynamism. We need change. We need to radically upend the way that our society works if we're going to have any chance of protecting the people who are most vulnerable during this time of climate change. And so there's this trade-off between let's just stick with the status quo. That's generally what people who are comfortable and wealthy, and all of us, we're all in the 1%. If you make more than $34,000 a year, you're in the 1% globally. It's very comfortable to say, let's just wait until we know, and we'll never fully know, right? So the question is, how much do we need to know? And there's a trade-off between that and having some ability to move forward. So I guess
That's a good point, though, because I think we know that the status quo is having huge unintended consequences on the earth, on biodiversity, etc. And the question is, with the precautionary principle, where's the greater risk of trying some things or continuing down a road that has brought us huge success as a species, but the prospects aren't so good staying on that same road? I'm sure, Alan, you have the answer.
Yeah, right. If I had the answer. Well, let's go back to the question of this.
All right, we'll go back to the original question.
Consequences. Well, this is something, again, as a public scientist, I've been asking myself and my colleagues this question going back to the early 1980s, before there were any GM products on the market, food products anyway. And it was the the remit of one of the National Academy studies from 2004. What are the unintended consequences? And of course, the concern is that is there a hazardous unintended consequence, or maybe there's benign unintended consequences. And I was served on that panel with a dozen other experts from around the country. And after 2 years of study, we found that there really were no unintended consequences with GM technology that were not also found with conventional technologies. And what I mean by that is that, it's not appropriate to say this is a perfectly safe technology, everything's fine, don't worry about it, but rather recognize that what we do conventionally has undesirable consequences. Now, we mentioned the loss of topsoil due to tillage. Worst thing that humans have done in 10,000 years. One of the other nasty things that our ancestors have done over the last 10,000 years is monoculture. Right? That has a profound impact on biodiversity, because for every acre that we plow up and plant, one species, corn or soybeans, there may be some bugs in there, maybe some soil bacteria, but we're displacing hundreds of thousands of other species that used to call that home. We push them aside, and they're gone. So that's what farming is. Farming is inherently unnatural and unsupportive of biodiversity. So in that context, when you ask about GMOs and their impact on, for example, biodiversity, it's virtually nil. In fact, if anything, it's positive, because you're taking a corn plant that's growing in that field and you're inserting a gene from a bacterium or something. So the genetic biodiversity actually increases by one gene, right? It's a tiny amount, but we don't lose any biodiversity. And the other thing, we all agree, I think we all agree, that biodiversity is truly important, and keeping old land races and obsolete varieties absolutely crucial to our future. But it's not up to farmers to steward those. It's up to professionals to look after them in gene banks, and fortunately we have those scattered around the world. So as far as biodiversity is concerned, I'm a big proponent of biodiversity and maintaining the germplasm as effectively as we can, but not saddling that responsibility on farmers who are trying to make a living, and they want to grow the best crops that they can for their particular farm. And that's why I think that over 90% of American farmers who grow corn are growing genetically engineered varieties. Over 90% of American farmers who grow soybeans are growing genetically engineered varieties. Over 90% of American farmers who grow cotton are growing genetically engineered varieties. So, if you say that you support American farmers, and American farmers are doing their best to provide a sustainable, safe, and wholesome food supply, think about that 90% who are growing genetically engineered varieties.
Paul, what would you add to this?
I would say, just pointing out the fact that he just said that, that's a fact, that over 90% of those three crops are used, and many of those are used in conjunction with the herbicide glyphosate. I don't even know how to, I keep on saying it. Glyphosate, sorry. I'm really concerned about that one thing just because I did so much research on it. 1964, it was patented as a descaler, for boilers. And then it was found out that when you emptied out the boilers, then it killed all of the plants around it. And they said, oh, well, this is great. It's going to kill plants. We use it as an herbicide. So in 1969, it was patented as an herbicide. In 2005, it was also found out that it was a great desiccant. So if there was a crop like wheat, you could spray this a week ahead of time, kill all the weeds so it wouldn't clump up and clutter the harvester, but it would also start to dry out the product, which made the process more efficient. But you're using more of that same chemical. And then in 2010, it was patented again as an antibiotic because some of its properties were killing bacteria. So in some cases, it's killing negative bacteria, bacteria that you don't want, but also it's killing some potentially positive bacteria. So those bacteria that one herbicide is killing also goes into the ground, and I think, and if it makes its way into the food, could be reducing the bacteria, or there could be damaging some bacteria that is in the soil naturally, that's creating those processes, or even has been said, in your own gut, in your own micro, gut, all the things that are living inside of you and your large intestine that are helping communicate back and forth and create small chemicals, it's possible it could be damaging a few of those. And I know there's health issues, and I am not a scientist, but there's been many toxicology studies that I've read about, trying to analyze that and about those, does that, I don't know anything about the medical process of it, but the increase of the use of that one herbicide over the course of years also correlates to the increase in a lot of, diseases that have been, kidney, and I don't know if any of that is true, but it has risen, and they're using agriculture data and it's all U.S. data that's being correlated into the same thing. And you could say, well, the wind blows and the fan turns at the same rate, so the correlation data could be the same. But 1% is exact, and 0.99 and 0.97 is where it kind of correlates. So it makes one think, would that have anything to do with it? And it's not the GMO. I mean, I'm not saying in any point it's the GMO. I'm saying the GMO crop that is herbicide resistant is allowing us to have higher yields, but also using that one herbicide, more prevalently than may have been done in the past.
Would you like to add anything to this?
In 2010, again, the Academy conducted a study on the effect of genetically engineered crops on farm sustainability in the United States. And they looked at these types of questions across the board and came to the conclusion that there was really only one concern with these genetically modified crops, and that it's not a medical or a health issue. And this is one of the distinctions between the scientific medical community and the general public. The general public, their first concern is health and safety, right? In the scientific community, there is consensus that these products are safe. The ones that have been approved are safe. And our concern in the scientific community is more on the environmental side, where we do actually see some real things to be concerned about. The only thing in this 2010 study from the Academy was that overuse of a particular herbicide can lead to the development of weeds with resistance to that herbicide. So then farmers with weeds on their farms that were resistant to glyphosate would then have to go back to spraying with what they sprayed previously, right? Which typically are nasty chemicals, nastier chemicals than is glyphosate. Now, I would urge you not to conflate GMOs with pesticides, right? Yeah. People are concerned about pesticides, and that's fair enough. I am too. But not all GMOs are involved in any way with pesticides. They're not all glyphosate. Some of them are BT, right, for insect control. The same BT is the same stuff that organic farmers use to control insects on the organic crops. Other GM crops have nothing to do with pesticides or weed control. The things like disease resistance. We also have more recently, non-browning potatoes, non-browning apples. A lot of new products are coming through the system that have nothing to do with pesticides. So if you're concerned about pesticides, I encourage you to do your diligence and work on that. I'm also concerned about pesticides. They are all controlled, by the way, regulated by EPA, right? And to a large extent, I have a fair amount of trust in EPA, partly because I know them and what they do. And I know a lot of people don't trust EPA very much, and that's, again, your decision. But at least they're regulated. And if we were going to see a problem, the first place we would see the problem is in the Midwest, where farmers have now been growing these things year after year for 20 years. Right? We don't see any increase in any medical conditions in these farmers who are using the GM crops or the pesticides, for that matter, for now 20 years. So our scientific predictions back from the 1980s, suggesting that GM technology is simply a tool. We're harmed by substances, not by actions, right? Not by the processes that give rise. So the focus should be on the final product and not the process that gives rise to it. And if you're going to use pesticides, well, farmers are going to use pesticides. Whether they're growing GM crops or non-GMO crops, they're going to use pesticides because they have to control weeds, insects, fungus, bacterial diseases, and other things.
So we all are in agreement, I think. Biodiversity is very important. Ed Wilson, the man who coined that term many years ago, just wrote his 32nd book, Half Earth, in which he argues we have to set aside half the land and half the ocean if we're going to conserve biodiversity, and that if we don't conserve biodiversity, it puts the human species at some risk. And there was a quote, I won't get this quite right, but basically Ed Wilson said, "I know my colleagues are going to skewer me for saying this, but if we want to conserve the world's biodiversity, we are going to have to rely more heavily on GMOs as we go forward." And his argument is based largely on leaving more of nature undisturbed through farming. Grow more crops on less land, using less water, etc. Would you agree with anyone?
Well, I don't need to go now. You guys
Go
have
ahead.
spoken for a while. Go ahead.
So, how do I put this? There's so many things to say about this. I mean, I started out as a real opponent of industrial agriculture, and the more that I looked at it, the more I came around to exactly what E.O. Wilson was talking about there. There are some somewhat optimistic, but still very reliable environmental scientists who think that we're at peak farmland at this point. And if population tops out at 10.5 billion and trends continue as they are, our footprint is going to be decreasing on this earth from last year, basically, on out. That would be a tremendously positive, heartening thing in my life. At the same time, there does tend to be this same divisiveness against the farm as much as you can, as intensively as you can, because that's what's best for the environment, versus let's go organic and have biodiversity on the farms type people. And they're just, I don't think there needs to be this divisiveness, because the organic farms aren't great for biodiversity in terms of having lots of wild species there. They're a little bit more biodiverse than industrial farms. But what they're really good at is creating these living seed banks, being biodiverse in the living things that they produce, and creating beauty and deliciousness in our lives, and in pioneering techniques that aren't used in the very intensive farms. And I think that there's the possibility for, as technology increases in our lives, as we hopefully continue rising and growing richer, and more of the labor is taken out of our lives through technology, that and I think we're seeing this already in this somewhat post-work world. We're seeing people who want to be working with their hands every day and want to be stewarding the environment in a different way. And so I think there really is this potential for these two things to go hand in hand, where we do have very intensive areas where we're producing a lot of food and allowing the world to feed itself without spreading and cutting down the rainforests. And at the same time, we're seeing this shift so that we can have these transitional zones where we have this wondrous diversity of foods and culture.
Right. Let's go to our audience. If we could bring the house lights up just a little bit. Adina has a microphone. If you raise your hand, you can direct the question to the panel as a whole or to any individual. And the lady with the microphone determines, we have two microphones. We have two ladies.
Thank you. Your discussion is very interesting. I have not heard you talk about the potential of the attention deficit that has risen about at the same point of the use of the genome and the pesticides, or the aspect of the high allergies that we start to see in human beings, also following a very similar curve.
Anybody want to respond to that? The rise in the incidence of attention deficit disorder as we rely more on pesticides, herbicides, genetically modified organisms?
Well, we have correlations with lots of different things. People pull that out because they don't like GMOs and they're looking for an excuse, some kind of scientific, pseudo-scientific justification. But there's really no correlation, and it is not connected with GMOs. Whether it's the allergies, or you see autism as well. There's a whole range of things, bees, but none of them, when we investigate those types of correlations, we don't see any causality. Right? So, I mean, it is a concern to our modern society that, yeah, no question, there's an increase in allergies, but we can't blame GMOs for that, right? Because we see the same increase in places where they don't have GMOs, for example. And that's true for each of these correlations that gets brought up. You can't pit it on GMOs.
No, correlations
it's not causality.
Are very dangerous things. They do not imply causality. And I can remember when I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, Blair Kinsman, there was an article in a geophysical journal by Louis Post of the Hydrographic Service, and he had taken temperatures in the ocean and he had correlated them with how far south icebergs were. And he got a very high correlation coefficient. And so he said that we could measure temperatures and predict where the icebergs would be and the hazards to navigation. Well, Blair Kinsman, who was a mathematician, he took the planes landing and taking off at Logan Airport, which is in Boston. He got a better correlation than Louis did. Louis lost his job. Blair Kinsman, that was his one moment of fame in his article. But correlations are dangerous. Now, remember what Mark Twain said, though. Sometimes, he was trying to get at the fact that farmers were being accused of watering down their milk. And sometimes what I was trying to think of the word Mark Twain used, but anyway, the observation that when you look at your milk and if you saw a fish swimming in it, that was pretty good evidence. Pretty good evidence that the farmer had watered down the milk. That's a little better than correlation. All right, we have another one. Somebody.
Hello. It's kind of a follow-up to what you just mentioned, Alan. First of all, I love what Nathanael said earlier about let's separate the GMOs that are genetically modified in a just gene splicing and things like that versus GMOs that are designed to resist pesticides. I think it's really, really important to separate those two for purposes of conversation. And I also know that I'm a child born in the 50s, baby boomer. I know that I've seen film of scientists saying there's absolutely nothing wrong with tobacco smoke. You can smoke as much as you want, all you want. Doctors smoking away while they're, servicing clients, things like that. So, woulda, shoulda, coulda. And I also would like to, so we don't know what we don't know yet. And I get very curious about that, yes, correlation is not causation, but if that's not it, what is it?
Okay,
nobody seems to be coming up with what is causing it, so I find that interesting.
I spent a little time as working as a medical journalist before getting into food, and so I was very taken with these correlations as well, and spent a lot of time looking at allergies, and a little less time looking at autism, but some time. And yeah, if you go, the problem with the correlation is that the correlations you can, like any group I've started to find would find the correlation for their pet thing. So you could find the correlations with vaccine use. You could find the correlation with GMO food, but there are wags who have pointed out to me and shown me the math that there's an even tighter correlation with organic food. And so when I started talking to the epidemiologists and so what really is causing this? And so I think that the key is, let's go to the people who are trying to solve the specific problem, the people who are working on autoimmunity for allergens. And there's a wonderful book called An Epidemic of Absence about the allergenicity issue. With ADHD, there's these whole societies who are dedicated, and autism as well, to looking at these things. And I don't know if there's good evidence out there. You go beyond just the correlation, and you start asking, okay, what's correlation, but correlation specifically within these people who have these risk factors? Or are these risk factors, do they bear up under scrutiny and regression and that sort of thing? I'd be happy to talk more specifically about each of these, the evidence in each of these issues with anybody afterwards.
But I think we need to keep going. We had a question over here. Go ahead.
First off, thank you so much for speaking today. I really appreciated it. And I have a little bit of background to this question. So I'm a scientist. I'm a science educator. I often teach about climate change, and my goal is always to educate and empower. Now, as a traditional scientist, when I first started getting into this work, I went, you know what? I am going to have a couple of great graphics. I will have these explanatory chains, and they will change their mind. But I found that, most people are not scientists. They do not think with logic, and that we have to appeal to this irrational side of us that makes us human. And so I found that using value approaches really helps. If I have a kid who loves being outdoors, and I go with the protector of Mother Earth, that side. And if I have someone who is maybe a slightly more conservative individual, I go with the innovation value. Well, Americans are innovative. This is our time to change the way that we preserve our Earth, so on and so on. And I find that when educating about topics such as, vaccines and often with GMOs, I struggle with finding this value, because it always comes down to, hey, we got to trust science, And I sometimes use this hammer approach. It can help, it can hurt. There's two sides, but I sometimes struggle to find that value that gets away from this natural versus chemical argument. And I was really curious about what your approach to that is.
Anybody want to start with that?
Chemicals are natural.
Oh,
yeah. I encounter the same thing. There seems to be a dichotomy between the people who are saying, we're getting too far away from nature with all of this modern technology and genetic engineering, whether it's in food or medicines, vaccines, we're getting too far away from the way Mother Nature intended. And I say, we missed that bus 10,000 years ago. Well, literally, when our ancestors decided to cease being hunters-gatherers and settle down in communities and till the soil, that's when we started scraping the face of the planet, and we turned away from Mother Nature. Mother Nature, if we followed Mother Nature's strict dictates, there would only be 3 to 4 billion humans on the planet, right? We're already well over 7, on our way to 9 or 10. We're already way past Mother Nature. So if you truly want to go back to Mother Nature, don't expect to ever have known your grandparents or ever meet your grandchildren, right? Don't expect a car, a cell phone, clothes, right? Let's get ourselves into the most temperate, and I could go on like this for some time. And in fact, I have a book chapter, came out a year ago, exploring some of these factors. We are already unnatural as a species, and that's it.
I struggle with this all the time, because my job is to try and connect human to human and talk about evidence. And the thing is that that it's a very rational point of view to, I think, to be anti-GMO and to be anti-vaccine, and I'll explain why in this society. Because people make a rational decision about what's in this for me. What do I get from this? With vaccines, we have this amazing herd immunity at this point. There's very little chance of suffering personally for failing to take a vaccine. With GMOs, what does the consumer, what's the benefit to the consumer? I mean, it's very hard to make that case. And then are you going to ask this person to, read 500 pages of the National Academy of Sciences? I didn't want to do that. I'm a science journalist, and I had to be forced to do that by my. And by the way, read these things and possibly come to conclusions that will put you at odds with your tribe. Really didn't want to do that. So, I really don't know that there is a good answer except to say that if there's some way to launch that voyage of discovery, if there's some way to plant a seed of, like, there's something out here interesting, and if you look, I'll help you find the evidence.
I have to put it for a fourth grader, because I'm teaching fourth graders for 16 years now, Days of Taste, where food comes from. So I'm teaching them to read their labels so they know what's in it, but I also have to try to teach them a little bit about GMOs, a little bit about pesticides, a little bit other things that are in their food, and as well as that they're being marketed to by children. By corporations. Corporations put, cartoon characters on there. They're very colorful, so you'll buy that cereal because they like the cartoon character. They'll buy the cereal. I want them to be able to read the label and understand at least the nutritional factors and understand the basics of nutrition. But I think my goal is to connect smaller groups of people that I can affect in the city, and they are my customers, these children, the people that like gardening, to promote, grow your own at your own house, and you'll know exactly what's on the food that you have. If you have a small community farm, if you have a small community place, if you had one block, every one block had one household parcel of land and everybody could community farm that, it would be more food security in that one block, and it would make an impact, I think, globally, is that they wouldn't be bringing things in from so far away, and they would be a little bit more self-sufficient. And it's a small step, but it would be people understanding more about the food that they're eating, and it would be more biodiverse, I think, because you're growing a wide variety of things. I serve purple carrots, white carrots, orange carrots, yellow carrots all the time, and people will tell me, it's like, wow, I've never seen a purple carrot. I mean, they're getting a little more common now, but orange carrots are relatively new. Yeah. Late 1500s, the Dutch popularized them very well, but before that, we had these little skinny white and purple carrots, and they didn't taste good, and those varieties aren't around anymore. They've evolved, but to basically just be more diverse in we're eating. If you eat anything and you only eat one of something, thinking that's healthy, cabbage, it's healthy, eat a lot of that. You can't just eat cabbage and be healthy. You have to eat all the rainbow of colors, and to teach children that now is very satisfying to me, because if I can inspire them to grow their own garden, if I inspire them to know what's in their food, inspire them to eat more diverse, I think they will be healthy. Be the type of person that would take vitamins, but eat them instead. So eat them in the form of vegetables, so they're getting their fiber, they're getting their vitamins, and it's a more natural product.
Very good point. Another question. We have one over here.
Mr. McHughen, you mentioned after a study that you did not see any health concerns, but you did see some environmental concerns, and you gave the example of plants being less resistant to a pesticide or herbicide and therefore going back to the older version, which was worse. Could you tell me what were some of the environmental concerns you had other than that?
Yeah, that was one of the National Academy studies.
Yeah, the 2004 study was concerned with food specifically. The 2010 was concerned with environmental sustainability. And the question that panel was asked, and I did not serve on that panel, I was involved in the production, but not on the panel itself. They were asking, is there a way for genetically modified crops to fit into a sustainable future in American agriculture? And they were the ones on this panel to identify the problem of overuse of particular pesticides with GMOs, and notably the Roundup Ready types giving rise to increasing numbers of weeds that have resistance to that herbicide. Once the weeds develop resistance, they grow, and if the farmer sprays Roundup, glyphosate on that crop, then the weeds continue to grow. Ordinarily, it would kill them. So it's not effective. The farmer loses money, wastes his time, buying the chemicals. Farmers don't like buying chemicals any more than the rest of us do. And so their solution was to go back to spraying with the chemicals that they used before getting access to the genetically modified crops, right? These other chemicals, and there's a whole range of them. Like there's a dozen categories of herbicides for weed control, post-emergent, pre-emergent, selective, non-selective, and depending on the type of crop you're growing and the type of weeds you have showing up in the crop, you select the appropriate one to kill, whatever species of weed is in there. And that's, the panel determined that really was the only type of environmental concern they had with GMOs. GMOs do not spread more than non-GMOs. Spreading, putting out pollen or seeds and invading nearby areas, that happens with plants depending on the nature of the species itself. Genetically modifying that species, you start out with a genome of like 40,000 genes and you add 1 or 2 genes. As long as they don't influence fertility or seed production or something, it doesn't change their reproductive and invasive characteristics. So you look at the species to look at invasiveness. But yeah, the only one that really was identified by this panel was the development of resistant pests to the chemical agent. And they also noted, by the way, that the evolution of pests with resistance to the agent also occurs with conventional crops. So it's not new or unique to genetically modified crops.
Let's take another one. Who has got one down here and several in the back? And I want to let's pose the questions as crisply as you can so we can get to as many as possible.
Thank you. Okay, to that point, are we going to have cross-pollinating genetically engineered crop with non-GE crops? I mean, will it all eventually become GE crops?
I'm sorry, what was
GMO?
Hold the microphone closer to
Are we going to have
I couldn't hear that.
cross-pollination?
To your point about cross-pollinating, will we ultimately have GE crops in the end? Just naturally
Everything gonna end up
pollinating
being
with
genetically engineered.
non-GE crops?
I doubt it, but that's just speculation on my part. What we have to remember is that everything we eat has been genetically modified using one technique or another, right? The genes are different from what they were 10,000 years ago, using either traditional forms of breeding or ionizing mutagenesis, ionizing radiation mutagenesis, embryo rescue, somoclonal variation, lots of other techniques that are considered traditional breeding. They all involve changing the genes around, sometimes scrambling the genes in ways that we have no idea what they do. So, everything we eat, almost everything we eat, with the exception of some like wild berries or maybe some ocean fish, has been genetically modified over the years. Now, whether it becomes genetically engineered, I suppose, depends on whether scientists, whether they're in companies or USDA or a university, sees an opportunity to improve that particular crop by genetically engineering it, as opposed to using one of these other tools of plant breeding. But if you're concerned about the distribution in the biosphere and encountering genetically engineered products, I think that boat has already shipped out as well. I mean, things like, when 90% of our vegetable oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, canola oil, came from genetically engineered plants. Now, the oil doesn't have any DNA or protein in it, so there's, chemically, there's no difference between corn oil from a genetically engineered plant and corn oil from a non-genetically engineered plant. Do you consider that to be a GMO? The Europeans do, for purposes of labeling. Similarly with the sugar, right? If it comes from a sugar beet, even though there's no DNA or protein in the sugar, it has to be regulated as a GMO in Europe and also labeled. But what they're missing is that, if you remember back in high school, you studied photosynthesis. Sugar comes from photosynthesis, right? I mean, the plant captures sunlight. And it converts that sunlight into sugar, and it releases, any guess? Oxygen. What happens to the oxygen? It goes up into the air, and it gets scattered all over the world, and we're breathing it in right now from billions of acres of GMO crops. That oxygen is genetically engineered according to the European definition. So,
All right, we got another one?
Yes, I have a
Question.
question. Here at the aquarium, we use, hi, it's me.
okay, thanks.
Here at the aquarium, we use educators, we use visual aids, we use a lot of different things to tell the story that the fish in our exhibits can't. What's the story for GMOs?
Well, GMO's natural, for one thing.
Well, okay, sorry. I heard you spewing off a bunch of facts, and facts is definitely a way to get information across, but how do we get people to care? How do we get people to invest themselves in the story? So I guess I want to know from you, Alan, since you're a science educator, what's the story you tell?
What's the hook? You know,
Yeah,
you-
no, I,
what-
you know,
what-
I
what-
think my job would be so much easier. I'll just answer this very
Okay.
quickly and then turn it over. If we could just listen to Paul and get people far more involved in food production, right? Have your little garden, even if it's, you know, the size of a table in your back garden, right? Grow something. Learn what plants look like. Learn what the insects that eat those plants look like. Eat the produce. I mean, you know, grow some tomatoes. You will have, you know, those tomatoes will be the best tasting tomatoes you've ever had. I guarantee it at the end of the season. They'll also be the most expensive, but that's a different issue.
Nathaniel and then Paul, what would you add to that? What's the hook?
I think that's a great thing. Like the more that people can talk to farmers or be involved in farming and come to understand what these trade-offs are, and just, you know, if we don't want to use herbicides, if we don't want to have tillage, you know, we want to pay a fair living wage to the person that's out there weeding, and then people say, that's the decision I want to make. I really do want to pay for that $15 chocolate bar. You know, that's what it would really cost if we were paying the same, or not even the same, but a living wage to chocolate farmers. And I think that's tremendously important. I think that the other issue is that, again, GMOs, there's no story there. It's just facts because it's not a thing. But if you look at the individual species, if you look, I mean, so I was just talking, we were talking about this banana that they're engineering in Uganda, and there's this wonderful story about this. And the guy that's his name Wilberforce Tush something, and I can't pronounce his full name. That's the head of the Ugandan banana government organization. And they just call him Tush. And I was talking to him about, you know, why this is important to him, and at some point, and I said, can you hook me up with a farmer? Like, what do real small farmers think about this? And he's like, well, that would take a while, but you should know that I was born on a small farm. I grew up as a subsistence farmer. I visit my parents, you know, and I visit this village all the time. And actually, almost every scientist in my organization, it's the same story. I mean, these are people who are tremendously connected to the peasants and who really have their best interests at heart and understand probably better than anybody else does what is useful and what is not useful for a small farmer in Uganda. I mean, so those are stories. If you look at the individual details rather than the big abstract concept.
And Paul, you're helping a lot of people write their own story by the kinds of things you do.
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to bring it back to the money you take out of your wallet. And no matter if you're a 5-year-old kid or a 95-year-old grandmother, you know, you take money out and you pay for something, that's your vote for that. You vote for the kind of food system you want. If nobody bought sodas starting tomorrow morning, all those companies would fold, they would reinvent themselves and make something that you would buy. I mean, and if you want more farmers markets, if you want to support local farmers, if you think that's important, then you should go there and support them. But if you're fine with you don't have time and you need to shop at a market and you get the waxed apples that have been put in cold storage and the tomatoes that have been gassed so they can turn from green to red, and that's okay with you, then that's where you spend your money. We can't tell you where to spend it, but if you want to be more connected with the food that you eat, and you read a little bit and you say, hey, this might be better for me if I eat a little bit more of this diversity, and if I can grow my own, then I'll teach my kids that that's a good thing, because that's how they're learning. Our young generation is learning, drive to the fast food or go to the 7-Eleven and you get this Twinkie and you get this soda and there's your breakfast. So they only know that. So they're learning that at home and at school. And don't count on the schools right now or right here in this city or in this county or to try to teach your kid about food education, because it's commodity to them, and they don't want to know. You don't want to know about pink slime, and you don't want to know about them rinsing meat with ammonia, because ammonia does not have to be listed on a label, as you stated before. It's a process. So when you get your meat, it doesn't say anything about ammonia or it being used, ammonia being used to sanitize it or to clean it, because it just evaporates and goes away. Therefore, it's a process and not an ingredient. But if you saw it, you would be upset. Right. So, just you vote with your dollar. We all do, and if you can grow your own, that's a great thing.
We're going to take one more question over here, and then we're going to ask the panelists to make brief closing comments.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to ask you to be devil's advocates, and each of you say, what do you think is your biggest concern about GMOs, or what do you think the biggest danger to GMOs is?
Who wants to start? What's your biggest concern about GMOs, or the biggest potential danger?
You start. Well, I'm happy to start.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. Well, two categories. One is scientific, and the other is more social. The scientific one is certainly there are environmental concerns with GMOs, with certain GMOs, as we've already discussed, the development of weeds or pests, insect pests, diseases with resistance to the mechanisms that's supposed to control them. That is a concern to me, and getting farmers to comply with the rules. I mean, the farmers are supposed to rotate their herbicides the same way they rotate their crops. Not all of them do. Most of them do, fortunately, but just, that kind of educational thing to get the farmers on board so that we can have, the benefits of this technology for a longer period. But that is a concern, and a scientific or technical one. On the social side, it concerns me that many people are voting against their best interest because they misunderstand the pros and the cons of this technology. Right? If they think a GMO, and this is a fairly common answer, a GMO is any product to which a chemical had been applied at any time. Right? I don't like chemicals. GMOs, I obviously don't like GMOs. Well, if you find GMOs, I mean actual GMOs, to which there's been substantial reduction in the amount of chemical treatment, that person might actually support that product. And we find those people say, yeah, I would support that kind of product. And so, again, as a public educator, it concerns me greatly the level of misunderstanding of what the technology is, first of all, as a technology, and also in agriculture and food production. As I was starting to say a bit earlier, my job would be much simpler if more people simply understood where their food comes from, what farmers actually do, as opposed to what they think farmers do, and how food is processed before it gets to their table.
Nathaniel, what was your answer?
Well, I don't have, again, I don't want to talk about GMOs, biggest concern about GMOs. I can talk about specifics. If I'm going to think about a general concern, my general concern, the biggest thing that bothers me is that we have a regulatory system now that it only makes sense to push something through the regulatory system if you can sell it to a lot of big farmers. And so the products that we get are herbicide-resistant products, because that's what a big farmer needs, because he can't go out and weed 10,000 acres of soybeans, and insect-resistant, which I think is a good thing. But it's only geared toward these big farmers, and there's farmers, small farmers in India that ended up using insect-resistant crops, but it's sort of they got lucky and they were able to benefit from it rather than having it made specifically for them. And we only see this, products that are being developed for the small farmers when it's a lot of charity money going to Uganda or something like that. And so I guess the biggest concern is that we have this regulatory system that only allows the Monsantos and the Syngentas to play and to service conventional agriculture. And we don't, we have products that are on the shelf right now that would, reduce the use of fungicide, disease-resistant products, but it just doesn't make sense to take them to market because it's a tough regulatory system.
Paul, what would you add? What's your greatest concern?
My greatest concern about GMOs is it is an enabler in the fact that you're able to use more Roundup Ready products. I'm really so worried about the research that I see out there and how that one herbicide that they're using has been patented for so many things as a desiccant, as a scale and a scale releaser, how it may isolate any kind of metal atom that is within an enzyme. So if you have something, it's not anything about the GMOs that I there's a scare factor in it, but it's really just that it enables this ramp up because we have so much Roundup Ready products that farmers maybe are not following the directions and they are using this one Roundup product over and over and over again, and somehow that's getting into the soil and maybe getting into our food and could have effects in things that we don't see because we have so many enzymes that we use in our bodies that would be transferred possibly to the plant, and it is that unknown that's the scariest thing to me. And I think it's scary to the public because they don't know what a GMO is. So it's not really the GMO, it's the fact that the GMO enables the not higher use, and maybe it's not as bad of a product as that we used to use, but it's just becoming more prevalent, the use, and so it's the unknown of whether that could go into the soil and affect things that we don't see, because there's lots of enzymes that are involved in us communicating with our stomachs, with plants to interact, and we don't know if it's good or it's bad. So it's a scary part because we humans want to know what can I expect, if I grow my own carrot and I see all the soil, then I know exactly what it is. If I get a pig from a farm and I make, I know what it ate and I make all my charcuterie from it and I feed it to my guests, then I have such good confidence that I'm in control of that food and it's wholesome. And then I can make them feel better that they think it's wholesome. But it's that unknown when it's a farm somewhere else, I don't have that control. So.
Time for our crisp, clear, concise closing comment from each of you.
Shall I start?
Yes, and I want you to set a high bar for crispness, clarity, and conciseness. What's the one takeaway you want everybody to go away with?
We need to produce 70% more food in the next 35 years than we do today. We need to do that increase in production, without increasing the land base, unless you want to dig up the Amazon rainforest and every reserve that we have. We have to do that with increasing stresses on our other resources. Topsoil is diminishing. We have pollution of various sorts around the globe that's interfering with crop production. We have climate change that's interfering with crop production. And we need to produce 70% more food in a sustainable manner. And remember, what we've been doing to date is not sustainable. It's what got us in the mess that we're in. So we have to change our system, produce more food on less land in a sustainable manner. Tell me what tool is going to enable us to feed the additional billions of people who are going to be here by 2050 and then into the future. We have a technology. We have it's an array of technologies. Genetic engineering is not only one. There are several different types that has now been in use since the 1970s. There's not a single documented case of harm to humans or other animals or the environment from the use of this technology. Are we going to throw that out? And if so, what are we going to replace it with in order to provide sufficient food for all of these people in a sustainable manner without plowing up the Amazon rainforest? If you come up with an alternative, I'd like to know.
All right, Nathaniel, what's your clear, crisp, concise takeaway message?
Well, I started by saying that I try and focus on the specifics. And I just, to hammer that home, one thing that has been challenging for me is that I write all the time about GMOs, and then, and I use that term, but it's very hard to define what a GMO actually is. And so that's another seed to plant. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, to discover, it's one of these things that we put in our stories and we put in our regulatory systems, but it has very fuzzy edges. And when we think about this versus traditional breeding, we tend to think about, industrial agriculture versus this farmer co-evolving with his seed over generations. But it's really industrial agriculture versus high-tech lab breeding, which is what traditional breeding is these days. And it's so fuzzy now that organic standards at this point have this very strict definition of outlining what a GMO means according to them. And by that definition, a huge number of the crops that organic farmers grow should be labeled GM, and they're trying to fix that right now because people have realized this. But it's a very tricky thing to define, and it shouldn't be thought of as a monolithic term.
Paul?
I would say just focus on eating real food, and get back to basics. If you can grow your own, that's great. If you can support a local farmer, then you have a better chance of knowing the food that you eat. You have more confidence in it. Eat a diverse diet. But I think on the subject of GMOs, I am thankful to these guys because I learned a lot being here as well, but also having to be ready for this. I had to do a lot of searching to try to find out the information that was out there, because it's not something that I'm diving into, and I take all the concerns of my clients and I say, hey, at one time I was going to say, yeah, GMOs, but GMOs is just that enabler for something that maybe I need to be more concerned about what I'm eating and how it was grown, and that's really the concern. And I think within our city of Long Beach especially, I mentioned it earlier today, there's thousands and thousands of pieces of fruit that hit the ground every single day here, and that kind of food waste is something we should pay a little more attention to. And if we see somebody that has a tree, like a neighbor that has a big tree full of oranges and they let them drop, maybe you ask them, say, hey, can I have some of those? Or make something out of it, and then use the resources that we already have here and make less impact outside of our city.
Thank you, Paul. I think this has been an excellent discussion. Arthur Kaplan, who is the professor and head of the Division of Bioethics at New York University's Langone Medical Center, wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education on September the 13th of 2013, and it was entitled, quote, Genetically Modified Food, Good, Bad, Ugly. He ends his article with this quote that I would like you to think about. Quote, genetic engineering is not yet solving the food challenges that face humanity. Despite industry bungling, market failure, and a lot of fear-mongering, however, it is our last, best, practical, serious hope. We thank all of you for participating in this course. The one that we will be giving in the fall, the working title is The Anthropocene, and I remind you all that's the era of man. The Anthropocene, the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning? Is it going to result in the loss of all life, or can we use it to end all the things we've talked about and start a new beginning and go down a new path? How about a big round of applause for our panel? I thought you were. Thank you.